Well, hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you to my orchid channel. Thank you very much for finding me in this crowded world of orchid YouTube video-ness. I try to grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia, without any help from greenhouses or grow lights or humidifiers or equipment, really just me and them inside, outside or not at all. So if that sounds like your uncomplicated, no-nonsense orchid growing, do hit subscribe because I post every week on a Friday. Amateur ramblings are what you're going to get, but sometimes there are successes which might help you in your orchid journey. And I'm going to give you 4 guesses as to what we're talking about today. Ta-da! Yes, Stanhopeas. Well, in fact, one. Well, no, we're going to talk about Stanhopeas, but this one particularly has burst into bloom for me, and the flowers don't last very long. So it's really fortunate that it's today, it's Saturday, and it's in bloom, and I have the time to make a bit of a deep dive into my Stanhopea collection. Oh, the fragrance. But first things, plant lovers, Stanhopea, it's not. It's Stanhopea. So apparently, according to, well, not apparently, the rules of nomenclature are if a plant is named after a person, then you pronounce that person's name as per the person's name in the Latinized version of the plant name, if that makes any sense. So this was named after a guy called the Earl of Stanhope, Stanhope being his title, the Earl of Stanhope, and you pronounce his name Stanhope. It was Latinized with an A at the end, hence you should be pronouncing it, I should be pronouncing it, Stanhopea. A great example of that is Clivia, the South African orange bulb, fabulous lily type bulb, very common here in Melbourne, and a great greenhouse bulb in other parts of the world. Anyway, named after Lady Clive, it should be pronounced Clivia. Anyway, there you go. There's some nonsense nomenclature carry on for you this lovely orchidy morning. So back to these plants. Stanhopea, which I'll try and remember. An amazing genus of plants. And I have seen a few in flower in Melbourne, which we'll get to. And probably in my early days of orchid growing, I decided, I found one on an online channel actually for buying orchids, which we'll get to in a minute. Kind of not a beginner orchid, I have to say, but if you can get the right one and you can get the right conditions, look at it. Incredibly satisfying because it's such a monster of a thing. So let's go through this one that's in bloom, obviously, and it's sensational. And then let's look at the other 3 that we've got here because they are not in bloom. All right, so Stanhopea as a genus. So largely the south of North America, Central America, and the north of South America, if that makes any sense. Basically, that band in the middle of the Americas are where you get Stanhopeas and their cousins, Coryanthes, which are a little bit further south or north South America. So they all tend to have flowers like this, really massive, quite complex structures and very complex relationships with their pollinators. So some of them, the blooms don't last very long and the blooming period is timed to the short lifespan of the particular insect that pollinates it. Isn't that incredible? I think the world of pollination and symbiotic evolution is quite extraordinary. So in some of the plants, the fragrance is very much about that, about attracting the pollinator and the shape of the flower, and then the weird physics of how the pollination actually occurs. Quite extraordinary. But what it means is that I think it's fair to say all the flowers in this group are massive, bizarre, and fabulous. And I think too, I mean, here am I to say, once you get it right, they're relatively easy. So this one, the fragrance is amazing, but let's not keep you in suspense any longer. This is Stanhopea oculata. Ta-da, ta-da. Oculata, yes, you can see those very clear dots in the flower, referring to eyes. Now, this baby is very much in that very Central American band, and it's relatively high altitude. So this one is described as a cold to intermediate grower. Hence, perhaps it's doing particularly well here for me in Melbourne. So our temperatures, as you might know from my other ramblings, don't get to freezing here for me where I am. So these are grown undercover. They have a polycarbonate roof, so they're not rained on, but they do get our cold winter nighttime minimums, but usually probably 1 or 2 degrees warmer than the exposed part of the garden, not undercover. So I'd say the coldest this would get to would be about 2-ish degrees centigrade. So, you know, the high 30s Fahrenheit, 36, 38. Not freezing, close enough to be chilly, but not super cold. And this one sails through it. In fact, the others do as well, but we'll get to those. So temperature-wise, this one can certainly suit what's called cold growing here in Australia, which means you grow outside undercover, but with no heating. I'm filming this in midsummer, ta-da. This is when a lot of them flower in some, well, either spring, summer, or autumn. So this time of year, but a lot do flower in summer. And this is certainly following the habit of a past experience, because it has flowered for me once before and I made a video about it. But since then, more water under the bridge, so we might just go over the whole sorry saga again. So these plants are described as epiphytes, and I think about 75% of the world's orchids are epiphytes, although a couple of species are sometimes described as lithophytic too. So I would imagine that's very much mossy rock faces where they can get their roots into detritus that's built up in crevices with moss and leaf, etc. But generally, I think fair to say epiphytes, which means, of course, lots of air movement. They have single, quite strong leaves from quite large pseudobulbs, and the flower emerges often from the base of the pseudobulb and will go down, which is one of the things you have to bear in mind when potting them. So we'll get to that. In this case, though, and I'll show you exactly where, the flower spike was initiated and it went up and then down. So it kind of grown over the top, caused me a little bit of a panic, but we'll get to that as well. So the flowering habit of these is quite particular. They tend to hang down and the flowers look amazing when you look up at them. These large, beautiful sort of paddle-like leaves, quite chunky, round pseudobulbs, and all the growth habits pretty similar. Now, there's quite a few hybrids of this group between the Stanhopeas and the Coryanthes, and I've got one to show you in a minute. But the flowers tend to look similar and they tend to grow in a similar way. So another consistent thing about these is their shady loving plants. So strong sunlight, and some of mine have got a little bit too close to the sun. They will get burn marks on the leaves. So it is a shadier plant. So it's very much an understory plant in the forest. So imagine it's in quite dense forests on the side of trees, quite a lot of dense leafy shade, but lots of air movement, lots of ambient moisture, humidity, rain passing through, damp moss, leaves, etc. However, one of them does come from an area that does have a dry season, but we'll get to that. So a shady spot is good. Keeping them moist generally is good, but we'll get to that. Not disturbing them, I think, is also good. They can just fill out their baskets. Allowing detritus to fall on it. So I've left other plants that are nearby, the flower stems and little leaves and all sorts of things just fall on the top. So I just leave that to break down. But then, as you can see, because of the way the flowers emerge, it's really important that you pot them in a basket that has got quite large slots. I've also potted this one in a small basket, but can you see the space between the wires there is really large. So that's really important, because if you don't do that, your flower spikes can get stuck and they won't come and they'll just rot. So first thing in potting them, whatever it is, it needs to be really open with space for a flower spike to go through, which means then when you're lining it, a good idea is to line it with sphagnum moss or loose coconut fiber. So not coconut fiber that is sort of pre-compressed to use in a hanging basket, because that's quite dense and sometimes has a membrane through it. So buy bags of loose coconut fiber and really loosen it up and gently line your basket. And then I would put sphagnum moss as well. And then I just use a regular medium bark mix. Quite a lot of sphagnum in there with the bark, and the roots really have lots of sort of juiciness to grow through. And all of these seem to be doing very well in those conditions. Now, the thing with this baby, and we'll turn it around so you can see the flowers come from last year's matured bulbs. So like with many orchids, the name of the game is good vegetative growth each year. So you get a mature pseudobulb, so you're going to get a chance of a flower. And this spike came out from the base. Now, the last time it flowered, the flower spike came out of the bottom of the basket as per the instructions. This time it arched out and started to try and grow through one of these slats here. And I realized these slats aren't wide enough, and the flower was starting to sort of get bunched up. So it's quite a rigid stem on the flower spike. But as it was here, I just had to try and lever it out and up without snapping it to encourage it to arch over the edge of the basket. Sleepless nights, plant lovers, as you can imagine, because these flower once a year. This actually has skipped a year for me, so it's been 2 years since it flowered. The flowers last for 4 or 5 days if you're lucky. I did not want to snap off that flower spike, but as you can see, it didn't. So tricky, the flower spikes can be tricky. So were I potting this again, I would probably go for something more like this, which has much wider apertures around the framework of whatever it is you're using. Whether it is a timber basket or it's a metal basket, I would perhaps get something that's got even deeper spaces between each of these sidebars, just to be on the safe side. So the flower spike emerged, and it happens relatively quickly. So some flower spikes will take months to mature and flower and open. This whole thing happened within a space of about 3 weeks, I think. The flowers opened this morning, so it wasn't open yesterday. The fragrance, which we'll get to, is heavenly. And unfortunately, maybe 3, 4, 5 days if you're lucky. Depends, I guess, perhaps on the temperature as well. If it's really hot, the flowers might not make it. But at the moment, we're sort of relatively coolish for summer, and it's just living its best life. So let's talk. I mean, the flowers are extraordinary. You can see the silhouettes and the size of them. It's kind of the size of a hand. They are massive. And some of these hybrids and forms have even bigger flowers. And there are others with much deeper colors and sort of very black and very deep burgundy browns. And then there's also one here that's quite yellow and quite ambery, but we'll get to that. So the flower, the fragrance. Now, I think there's a bit of vanilla in there. And I was asking my other half, who's quite a fragrance fiend, and he could smell banana, and a little bit of honey, I think. And he also thought there's a bit of a citrus note to it. So make of that what you will. What I will say though is it is a sweet note, and it's quite a high sweet note, not sickly, very mellifluous, and it has filled this room in a pleasant way. It's very, very beautiful. And I could understand why some little bee that gets born and has 3 days to live will go, oh, that smell is amazing. And as you can see, this has got 6 flowers on the spikes. Incredible. So I think we have covered oculata. The conditions, the grow conditions are pretty much consistent with all the others. So I keep this moist all year. In summer, I water it maybe twice a day because it will dry out really quickly. In winter, a little less. I put a topical application of slow release fertilizer in spring. And then throughout this growing season, it does put on a lot of growth, and the flowers, I think, take huge amount of energy. I do use liquid either fertilizers or tonics throughout the season, diluted down, so they can either be orchid specific liquid fertilizers or generic flowering plant fertilizers. I use a seaweed based solution, which is not a fertilizer, but it's like a living fertilizer, if you will. And sometimes the runoff from a worm farm, which you can dilute as well. Anything. I think with food, mix it up. Because like us, no one wants to eat the same thing day after day. So that's probably it for this one. Consistent sort of shady light. It does get a little bit of morning brighter light, particularly in summer and actually winter because the sun's much lower. But it does get quite a lot of filtered protection. It skipped a year for me last year, but it's flowered this year, and I'm thrilled about it, absolutely thrilled about it. And so when this one flowered, plant lovers, 2 years ago, I thought, right, I've got Stanhopeas nailed down, let me go and buy some more, which I duly did, and so let's look at those. Okay, on to our next specimen. And what you will notice is I do have Spanish moss hanging from the side of all of my baskets because why not, plant lovers? Why not have an opportunity to grow something else from your pots? Why not? And Spanish moss is a Tillandsia eucinoides. Fantastic. And it does really well here. It doesn't seem to mind our cold winters at all. And so I just break a little bit off and hang it on the corner of another pot, another basket, and ta-da, ta-da. I just think it's lovely. Anyway, now the other interesting thing about this whole group of plants is that many of them come from Mexico, and Most of them were sort of named in the first quarter of the 19th century. So by sort of the 1830s, a lot of them had been discovered and named. But one of them had been observed by Francisco Hernandez, the Spanish explorer, adventurer in the 16th century when he was in Mexico. And he saw a flower that the Aztecs were growing, and it's thought that that was Stanhopea tigrina, but there's all sorts of arguments about quite which it was. But nonetheless, the Aztecs were growing it apparently decoratively or as a garden plant, as we would. Isn't that extraordinary? So it probably has thousands of years of cultivation history, some of these, a bit like cymbidiums in China, which have been cultivated for millennia as well as a decorative plant. Hernandez sort of loosely translated the flower name as the lynx flower. I don't know if it looks particularly like lynx. Maybe it's the spots of them and it's kind of coming out of the dark forest. And I'm going to have to read out the name. So the Aztec name that he quoted it as being called is Quetzalcoatzictl. Isn't that interesting? Fantastic that possibly one of these species was grown decoratively a long, long time before the Europeans decided to give it another name. Anyway, this one is a hybrid between two species. Fact, actually, it's three. But so this is called Coryhopea Predator. Guess what the two species are? Yes, Stanhopea and Coryanthes. So it's a very similar type of plant, but from South America. So this is the first one that I bought, and I bought it in the glory days of COVID when we were all trawling online sites, spending way too much money on indoor plants, and this is when I began really collecting orchids. And I just never heard of anything like this. I kind of loved the name. It was from a seller further north, so I think perhaps in New South Wales, which is subtropical. And I really didn't know anything about these plants, least of all if I could grow it here in Melbourne. But here it is. And look, pseudobulbs getting seriously fat and juicy. Not a flower in sight. So the ancestor species of this are Stanhopea tigrina, Coryanthes macrantha, and Coryanthes brushmulleri. And yes, it was named after the beast in Alien by the originators of the cross. So it's a dramatic, very speckled, very colourful flower. And so it's been getting basically the same conditions as oculata. So lower light, plenty of moisture, same kind of regime. They're basically in the same place. And yet this one has quite consistently decided not to flower. So a great way to find out the origin of one of your hybrids is go to orchidroots.com, put in the name of the hybrid you've got, in this case, Coryhopea Predator, and a bit like Who Do You Think You Are, it will tell you what the species ancestors are. Who's your mama, who's your daddy? And in this case, it's those three species. So what you can then do is go to orchidspecies.com and look up each of those species to see what are the conditions it comes from, particularly temperature. So maybe the species ancestors will reveal perhaps why this hasn't decided to bloom yet. Of course, it might just be it's not mature enough. It was a division when I got it of only a couple of pseudobulbs, so it's taken about 3 years to really bulk up. And looking at the size of this bulb here, I think it's ready. So of the species, Stanhopea tigrina comes from, it's described as a cool grower, so that should work well here. And I have seen that in bloom in Melbourne. But interestingly, that does come from a place that does have a slightly drier winter. So it's a very moist, wet, seasonal forest in summer, but in winter, slightly drier. So in fact, what I might try and do with this one is really ease up on the water. I mean, all of them I don't water as much in winter, but I have a feeling now with Predator, I'm just going to maybe ease off a little bit more in winter and let it dry out perhaps really between each watering. So the other ancestor, Coryanthes macrantha, is from the north of South America and a consistently wet, moist environment, and described as a hot grower, which could be a problem. And then Coryanthes brushmulleri comes from a very similar but perhaps narrower distribution in North South America. Again, humid, moist, consistently so environment. Relatively highish altitude. In fact, most of these grow from quite highish elevations. And that is described as a cool to warm grower. So I think if you wanted to lay money on it, I think it could be described as a cool grower, this hybrid, and it should perhaps be okay. I think A proof of the pudding is how it's grown. So it's grown relatively well. Look at all those pseudobulbs, and you can see there's a new growth just emerging here, and there's a couple of new growths emerging here. So, you know, I really don't know why this shouldn't flower. But anyway, if anyone's growing Predator in a cooler climate, I'd love to know what your experience is with it flowering and when it might flower. Anyway, I think I probably missed it for this year. If it was going to flower, I think it would have. But who knows? We'll just continue to feed it and love it and give it indirect shady light. And I'm going to try and give it a little bit of a dry winter, but not dry out completely, and see what happens. Okay, next cab off our Stanhopea rank is this one, which is Stanhopea graveolens variety Venezuela. There you go. Now, this particular one comes from a band of Central America, so from southern Mexico to sort of Honduras, that little bit there, from relatively high altitudes, and once again described as a cool grower. And generally, high altitude plants do really well in Melbourne because they can take our cooler winter minimums, which don't freeze, and they can also take a bit of heat as long as you maintain the humidity around them. And graveolens, plant lovers, I'm here to tell you, means it stinks. But I wouldn't know because mine hasn't flowered yet. So it comes from the Latin gravis, heavy, olens, smelling. Heavy smelling, otherwise known as stinky. So it's one of those things that has a foul smell like rotting flesh, which would suggest then that it's going to be pollinated by flies or something that's attracted to rotting flesh. Now this one flowers slightly earlier, so spring to summer. So once again, if it was going to flower, it would have, I think, for me. So I've got this in a wider basket, bigger apertures. Again, I've just got loose coconut fiber, sphagnum moss, and medium-sized bark. Now I bought this as a division about a year ago, actually, and it only had a couple of pseudobulbs and maybe one leaf. So it was not in the best of conditions, and it's put up a growth. And then it's this year has just gone mad. So you can see those two green shoots there, and you can see on this side, which is very satisfying, it's starting to grow through the coconut fiber, which means that that root system and pseudobulb system within here is really filling out and exploring the basket, which I'm excited about. It means it's happy, I think. So fingers crossed. Oh, I can just see another little, goodness me, I can see a funny little spike emerging in there. I was about to say this time next year, let's see if it's flowered for me. Maybe in a month. No, I think that's probably just a new growth point. Who knows? We'll see. It's never flowered for me before. Anyway, this one, unlike all of its cousins, stinks to high heaven when it flowers. And perhaps the last and possibly the most famous perhaps name out of this whole group is this one, Stanhopea nigroviolacea, and this one is a form called blackout. But as our botanic friends are wont to do, the name has changed on this type, so it is now Stanhopea tigrina variety nigroviolaceae. Anyway, who really cares about such things? I don't. It happens. Hey ho. There are more important things, I think, to be outraged about. So this one, I have seen in bloom in Melbourne. And in fact, when I went to go and visit Ali's wonderful orchid collection a couple of summers ago, I think now, hers was in bloom. I can't remember if I included it in the video, but I'll link the video anyway. Her collection's amazing. And she grows outside all year, not undercover. She grows some things inside, but a really great collection. So I'll link that video and do have a look. It's always great to see how other people grow things in your city. So this one I bought after oculata decided to flower for me, and I thought, hey, I've got this all figured out. Well, I haven't, because this baby has not flowered either. I think, though, we can concede, plant lovers, that that is one very, very healthy plant. Look at that tangle of pseudobulbs in there, and what you can see is a forest of new growths appearing. Now, once again, if this was going to flower, it would have done, and I'm assuming we're not missing anything. No. Now, the only thing is, of course, the slats are perhaps too narrow. So if a flower spike was trying to get out here, could have got stuck. Coming out the bottom would have been fine. So who knows? We'll have to see. But so far, no luck. So this one comes from the eastern side of Mexico, and this is the one that does have a seasonally drier period in winter. So lots of moisture and humidity in summer and a drier winter, which means I am going to actually try with this one and just keep it a little bit drier than its cousins, which might be difficult because they're all hanging in the same place. But I'm going to try and keep this one a little drier, I think, over winter and just see what it does. I must say, though, my care thus far doesn't seem to have hurt it at all. It has filled out this basket wonderfully. Always got great foliage, always got new pseudobulbs, and it's got so much growth now. Anyway, I would love you to flower, my little friend. Or am I just pushing them too far out of their climate comfort zone and it's just too chilly in winter? Once again described as cool to warm, relatively high altitude, so it should do really well. And as I said, Ali was flowering hers really well in Melbourne, so it should do well. I must say though, I have a feeling hers was getting a lot more light. So that could be the thing. Although these are supposed to be shade lovers, maybe mine are too shady. Often one of the reasons why your orchids don't bloom. However, oculata is in exactly the same spot and that has flowered consistently for me. So who knows? At the moment, I can't do anything about it. When we move later in the year, maybe I'll try and give them a little brighter indirect light. Nothing direct because the leaves will really get damaged. But there we are. I think, plant lovers, we're at the end of our Stanhopea epic. So if you grow yours in a similar environment to me, i.e. cool, no heating, I'd love to know how you go. Obviously this one's fine for me, but the others I'm curious about. Love to know any of your tips and tricks to see how easy or not it is to get yours to decide to bloom. Sometimes with an orchid, once it decides to bloom, that's it, you're fine and off it goes. I've also had things in the same position for years, not bloom, and then suddenly it does and continues to do so. Can be about maturity. The plant's just not ready. One of these I only just received and repotted, and it was a bit of a weak division. Another one was a weak division 3 years ago. I don't know. All of these things play a part in a plant deciding to or not flower for you. But we are celebrating the fact that oculata, with its two eyes on you, has decided to bloom. And it's such a brilliant, joyous, mad, extravagant thing, isn't it? I mean, unlike anything in the orchid world, the size, the drama, and the fragrance of these flowers. So plant lovers, very exciting that I happen to be available to film this when this is in its full flight. I hope wherever you are, your orchids are in full flight, giving you great bang for buck and bringing you endless joy. And what will also bring you endless joy, I'm sure, is the fact that I post every week on a Friday. So if you want to know what I'm doing next week, hit the subscribe button and we will both find out what I'm doing next week. But until then, plant lovers, I hope all's well in your world and I look forward to seeing you next week.